This is Perspectives, a bi-weekly investment podcast brought to you by Escala Partners. In a world cluttered with information, Perspectives cuts through the noise to bring you insights and commentary on global financial markets, economics, and geopolitical news and events.
Welcome to Escala Investment Perspectives. Equity markets have been buoyed recently by the prospect of a peace deal in the Middle East, combined with enthusiasm around the IPO market in the US. And in addition to this, CapEx plans for anything AI continue to accelerate. So far, 2026 is proving to be a pivotal year, and it feels like there's more to come. But today, we'll look at the key thematics to consider in markets and how these thematics are linked. And of course, to take us through the detail is our Chief Investment Officer, Tracey McNaughton. Welcome, Tracey.
Hi, Ed.
Now, Tracey, last week you had the opportunity to hear from former CIA Director and General David Petraeus and former US Secretary of State John Kerry. One of them comes from a world of military strategy and intelligence, and the other from diplomacy and international relations. And yet both spent a surprising amount of time talking about technology, artificial intelligence, and strategic competition. Now, for years, investors thought of geopolitics and technology as separate conversations.
Yeah, that's right, but not anymore. And I think General Petraeus put it very neatly. He said the holiday from history is over. And as you said, for most of the last 30 years or so, investors operated in a world where efficiency was the dominant objective. Companies and governments alike optimized supply chains, and capital just flowed to wherever labor was the cheapest. Geopolitics, largely for the most part, sat in the background. But today, countries are seeking greater control over the assets they view as essential to their future prosperity and security. This includes things like energy and semiconductors and critical minerals and, artificial intelligence and defense capabilities. In many ways, we've moved from a world focused on efficiency to a world now focused on resilience. This restructuring, if you like, is what we would call the sovereignty trade.
Right, Tracey, for most of our investing careers, we've been taught that efficiency creates value. So what's changed? Why are governments suddenly prepared to sacrifice efficiency in favour of resilience?
Yeah, it's a good question. A quote I keep coming back to is one that Petraeus referenced from the Singapore foreign minister. And he said, the world is now shifting from unipolarity to multipolarity, from free trade to protectionism, from multilateralism to unilateralism, from globalization to hyper-nationalism, from openness to xenophobia, and from optimism to anxiety. And then he said, this is not merely a sudden temporary change in diplomatic weather. This is geostrategic climate change. And I thought that captured what is happening brilliantly, because it explains why governments are changing their behaviour. Over the last decade, a series of shocks exposed vulnerabilities that many countries didn't realise they had. COVID and the Trump trade war exposed dependence on global supply chains. Russia's invasion of Ukraine exposed dependence on energy imports. Semiconductor shortages exposed dependence on a handful of manufacturers. And more recently, the race for artificial intelligence has exposed dependence on advanced chips, data centres, and critical minerals. So governments have realised that the most efficient supply chain isn't necessarily the most resilient supply chain. And in a small way, Ed, it reminds me of riding a motorcycle. On a bright sunny day with empty, dry roads, you can focus on efficiency. You can go a little faster, you can lean a little further. But when the weather turns, the visibility falls and conditions become more uncertain. And so you have to ride differently. You ride for safety. You leave a bigger gap, you slow down a little, you position yourself more carefully. In other words, you trade speed for safety. And I think countries are doing something similar. The world has become more uncertain, there's no doubt. supply chains have proven fragile. Energy security can no longer be taken for granted. We know this, we're feeling it. Access to semiconductors and critical technologies matters more than ever. So governments are becoming less focused on maximum efficiency and more focused on ensuring they can keep operating under more difficult, uncertain conditions. And once resilience becomes a priority, well, then the conversation changes. For decades, economics drove geopolitics. Today, it's almost the reverse. The economics of a country have to adapt to the uncertain geopolitical landscape.
Tracey, you've talked about the shift from efficiency to resilience, but resilience isn't something you can simply declare. Why does the pursuit of resilience inevitably lead governments back to infrastructure?
Resilience ultimately depends on capability. If you want energy security, then you need to build the power generation and transmission networks that deliver it. If you want leadership in artificial intelligence, then you need to build the data centers, the semiconductor capacity, and the communication networks to make it possible. The same can be said for strategic independence. Having resilient supply chains means building manufacturing capacity onshore, or at least bringing it closer to shore. Infrastructure is where sovereignty becomes real, I think. Infrastructure, if you like, is the physical expression of resilience. And that is why every road seems to lead back to infrastructure right now.
And artificial intelligence is the most recent example of that.
Exactly. One of the biggest misconceptions in markets today is that AI is primarily a software story. Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, sees it very differently. He talks about AI evolving from generative AI to agentic AI and ultimately to physical AI. And what is amazing is the amount of infrastructure required to make that happen. One strategist I read suggested AI-related infrastructure spending could eventually exceed $1 trillion annually. That's investment on a scale normally associated with nation building. And increasingly, governments view that infrastructure as strategically important. General Petraeus argued that countries that fail to invest in these technologies risk falling behind strategically, not just economically. In his view, the future battlefield will be shaped by autonomous systems operating at a scale and speed humans simply can't match. That's why governments are increasingly viewing AI infrastructure the same way they once viewed railways, ports, and electricity grids. It's not just technology infrastructure, it's strategic infrastructure.
Right, so we've talked about AI as infrastructure, but a lot of people still struggle to see how these technologies move from impressive demonstrations to something that changes the real economy. I know you've spoken to clients about an interesting example in the health sector. Can you elaborate on this?
Yeah, it was a discussion I had with a venture capital firm in Boston about an agentic nurse. So imagine an elderly person living alone. Every morning, an AI nurse calls them and reminds them to take their medication. It asks whether they've checked their blood pressure, whether they've had breakfast, whether they're feeling well. Now, the patients are told that the nurse is an AI agent. And initially, this patient in the recording that I heard was skeptical about talking to a robot, as you would be. But after a while and after several calls, the patient forgot that he was talking to a robot. Now, that doesn't sound revolutionary, but I think this is where it gets interesting. The AI agent doesn't simply complete the task and hang up. It stays on the line and it chats. It asks about their grandchildren. It asks whether they enjoyed the football on the weekend. Perhaps last week they mentioned that they were nervous about a doctor's appointment. The following week, then, the AI agent asks how it went. It remembers the conversation. It remembers the person. And so it builds rapport. And suddenly you realize this isn't just software then, this is intelligence performing work. It's not replacing a nurse entirely. The nurse is left to do the more important stuff, but it does dramatically extend the reach of healthcare. And now imagine that happening across millions of elderly patients simultaneously. That's agentic AI in action. And once you have an AI that can reason, remember, communicate, and build relationships, moving into the physical world becomes much easier. A humanoid robot is really just the next step. And we are hearing a lot about humanoid robots and the demand and the supply that's going to come through. That's why Jensen Huang talks about physical AI as the next frontier. He's talking about humanoid robots. Because once intelligence becomes a productive asset, it can be deployed almost anywhere.
Tracey, if resilience requires infrastructure and infrastructure requires investment, are we witnessing the beginning of a new capital cycle?
Yes, I think so, because every major investment cycle starts with a problem that society decides it has to solve. The railways connected communities, electricity powered economies, the internet connected people. Today, we're building strategic capability to improve resilience of countries. Countries want secure energy. They want secure communications and semiconductor capacity. They want secure supply chains. And solving those challenges requires investment, lots of it. So we are witnessing the beginning of a new capital cycle, a nation building capital cycle. Previous nation building capital cycles were largely driven by efficiency. This one, in contrast, is increasingly being driven by sovereignty, the desire to ensure that nations can continue operating when the world becomes less certain.
Tracy, another difference this time around is that many of these infrastructure projects aren't being funded by governments. They're increasingly being funded by private capital.
Yes, and I think that is one of the most important features, really, of this capital cycle. Historically, when nations wanted to build strategic capability, governments were typically the primary source of funding. Today, the strategic imperative is just as strong, but many governments are carrying historically high debt burdens, particularly after COVID. They simply don't have the fiscal flexibility that they once had. And then you overlay on that the cost of an aging population. There's a big burden on government budgets. So we're seeing a different model emerge. The objective remains national, but increasingly the capital and execution come from the private sector. And that's important for investors because it means many of the beneficiaries of the sovereignty trade won't necessarily be governments. They'll be the companies building the infrastructure. In many ways, private capital is becoming a partner in the rebuilding of strategic capability.
It's probably a good time now to talk about SpaceX. And it spent its first 24 years of life as Elon Musk's private company. And now, following its IPO last week, it's a publicly listed company with a market capitalization of over US $2 trillion. Now, is SpaceX the ultimate example of a sovereignty trade?
Well, I think SpaceX is the sovereignty trade writ large. It's private capital helping build infrastructure that will become strategically important to nations. Launch capability, satellite communications, space-based intelligence, global connectivity, national security. If you go back 20 or 30 years, most people would have assumed these were government responsibilities. Today, a private company is providing capabilities that governments and militaries, corporations and individuals increasingly depend upon. And that's a big shift. Historically, governments built and owned strategic capability. Today, they're increasingly becoming customers of it. And I think that's why the IPO captured so much attention. Many people looked at the valuation and asked how a rocket company could possibly be worth $2 trillion, $2.5 now. But I think they were asking the wrong question. The question isn't whether SpaceX launches rockets. The question is whether SpaceX is building infrastructure. And I think the answer is clear. In fact, page 3 of the prospectus said just that, building the infrastructure of the future. Investors are buying exposure to one of the most important infrastructure build-outs of our time. If the 19th century was built on railways and then the 20th century was built on electricity and telecommunications, then this 21st century may be remembered for building strategic capability, and SpaceX may prove to be one of the defining companies of that era.
Tracey, if you had to leave listeners with one final thought?
I'd go back to where we started. The holiday from history is over. The world is rebuilding. We're building energy systems and semiconductor capacity and AI infrastructure, communications networks, defense capabilities, and increasingly space infrastructure. The biggest mistake I think investors can make is treating these as separate stories. They're not. They're all part of the same story, the sovereignty trade. Nations seeking greater control over the assets that they view now as essential to future prosperity, resilience, and security. That's why I think the biggest investment opportunities of the next decade won't come from predicting next quarter's earnings. They'll come from understanding the forces that are reshaping the world around us. Because if General Petraeus is right and the holiday from history is over, then strategic capability matters again. And if that's the case, then understanding who is building it, who is funding it, and who ultimately benefits from it may be one of the most important investment questions of the decade.
So the last investment era was defined by efficiency, and the next may be defined by sovereignty. Well, that's all we have time for today. Thanks, Tracey, for those insights. Hope everyone enjoyed the update. And of course, we look forward to you joining us for the next podcast. Till then, please take care and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Escala Perspectives podcast. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast on iTunes. You can connect with Tracey by visiting escalapartners.com.au. Escala Partners is a corporate authorised representative of Escala Wealth Management, which holds its own AFSL. This podcast has been prepared without consideration of specific client investment objectives, financial situation, or needs, and is for general information purposes only. Please don't rely on it for the purpose of making an investment decision. You should seek independent financial and taxation advice prior to making any investment decisions in relation to any of the content considered in the podcast, and consider any relevant disclosure documents. If you require any further information regarding the matters discussed on the podcast, please contact Escala Partners.